Welcome to Android What's That For? In this video I'm going to be talking to you about interfaces. Now instead of simply explaining to you what an interface is, I'm going to walk you through a scenario which should hopefully demonstrate how using interfaces can help you write better code, solve software architecture problems, and manage changing requirements before you even know what those requirements are. All that and more in just a moment.
Oracle defines a Java interface as follows. In the Java programming language, an interface is a reference type similar to a class that can contain only constants, method signatures, default methods, static methods, and nested types. Method bodies exist only for default methods and static methods. Interfaces cannot be instantiated. They can only be implemented by classes or extended by other interfaces. That's a super simple definition of a Java interface, and if you don't understand it the first time you read it, then you should probably just quit. Okay, I'm totally joking about that. So instead of throwing a whole bunch of jargon at you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through kind of a mock scenario which should hopefully demonstrate a couple of things. So what I want you to imagine is that we are Android engineers, and our job, while we're working on pre-release Android 1.0, is to basically figure out a way in which a widget, like a button in this case, can communicate with an activity. So, over the course of these examples, I'd like you to pay real close attention to a couple of things, because there's a couple sort of really important themes that have really big implications, and also sort of through that you'll also hopefully start to see how interfaces can solve some of those problems. So in particular, there's three things I want you to pay close attention to. We're going to solve this problem a couple of different ways. And the things I need you to pay attention to is our first solution to the problem a smart solution? Secondly, how did changing requirements make it obvious that our first solution wasn't going to cut it anymore? And thirdly, is using an interface a better way to solve the problem? So without further ado, we're going to jump into the example. Now, I'm going to suggest that you actually follow along with me in the code. I think that'll make for a much better learning experience for you. So you might want to go ahead and create a new blank project in Eclipse or Android Studio or whatever you're in. I'm working in Android Studio, and yeah, let's jump into the example. Okay, so at this point I'm going to assume that you're following along and you've created a new blank project with an activity called main activity. Doesn't actually matter if you called it something different, but just as a starting point, that's what we're going to call it. So the first change I'm going to make is I'm going to head over to the activity's name, double click on it, and highlight it. I'm going to hit on my keyboard Shift F6. I'm not sure what the equivalent would be with a Mac or if it's different, but that's the shortcut to rename a class in Android Studio. It might be a little bit different for Eclipse, and we're just going to change the name of this to Main Activity 1. Now, the reason why we're going to call it Main Activity 1, and do note that that has also changed the file name, is because we're going to write the activity and the button in sort of two different ways. The first way is going to be a way that works, but it's going to cause a bunch of problems down the road. And then main activity 2, which we'll create later, we'll use the interface, and that'll be the proper one. So I'm just trying to explain to you why I'm doing that. So we've got our main activity 1, and I'm going to have you head over to the main package. Whatever you've called it is fine. Right-click on it, go to New, Java class, and you're going to type button1. Now, once again, the reason why it's called button1 is we're going to be creating two implementations. Also, I don't want you to accidentally import the actual Android button class, so that's why we're doing that. So, our job is to create some way for this button class to relay click events to our activity. So the first way that we're going to do that is sort of by directly calling the activity. So what we're going to type is private main activity 1, and we'll just call that, we'll just call it main activity 1 there. And so we've created a field in our button class. We're also going to create a basic constructor. We're going to say public button1. And that's all we need to do there. And then we're also going to create a setter for our main activity 1 class, and we'll see why in a moment. In Android Studio, all you need to do is right-click, go to generate, and then generate setter. I'm going to make sure that that's selected. Hit OK. And then this creates a basic setter for our main activity. One last thing we're going to do in button 1, actually two things, sorry. The first thing is we're going to make a method called onClick. So we're going to say private void onClick. And in this method, we are going to say main activity 1 dot onClick. And we're going to say get view ID. Now, obviously, neither of these methods have been created yet, so that's what we're going to do next. For this method, I'm going to click on it, hit Alt-Enter, that's on PC and Android Studio, and create a getter. And that's just going to return an int. And we're just going to return some random bit of numbers. So, what I've done here is I've created this onClick method. We're just going to assume and pretend that this method fires when a user clicks this button. Let's not worry how. Let's just assume that it works. Let's just assume that in a test application, someone clicks the button, and then that fires this method down here. Again, this is like pseudocode. So anyways, moving on. This getViewID method is just sort of as a demonstration thing. Let's kind of assume that ID is actually generated at runtime, which is the case in the actual implementation. But for now, we're just going to return 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as a generic number. The last thing we need to do is obviously we need to create this onClick method in main activity 1. So I'm going to click on that again, hit Alt-Enter, and then hit Create Method onClick. That's going to create the method for me back in main activity 1. All that stuff's correct. And all we're going to type here is just handle event somehow. Again, I don't actually care what happens. I just want to have this method called in the activity. So, this is a basic implementation of our button communicating with the activity. The last thing we'll do is let's go to the activity. We'll create a button. We'll say button1 button equals new button1. And then we're going to say button, I really can't type today, dot set main activity 1, and then we're going to say this. So what does this mean? If you're not familiar, this simply refers to the current instance of our main activity 1 class. In simpler language, we're just passing main activity 1 to this button by calling this method. That's going to call set main activity in our button1 class, which will assign this variable as main activity 1. And then when the user clicks on a button, it's going to directly call onClick, which is again this method here. And that's going to pass our onClick event from our button class to main activity 1. So, we've basically set it up so that, well, let's just pretend that this thing works. We've written a test application, you push a button on the screen, and that data gets relayed, this getViewID data gets relayed, and this method gets called in our activity, and something happens when that method gets called. So, this solution works. Now, there's a couple of problems with it, and that's what I'd like to get into next. Let's have a quick look at this class here. So, one thing I'd like to point out for starters is that this variable here refers to a specific class that we made called main activity 1. So naturally, that's a huge issue. Let's say we make another activity which wants to implement a button 1. There's a couple different ways we can solve that scenario. I'll show you the correct way to do it later, but junior developers or noobs might be tempted to do something like for every separate activity we make, they might add code like other activity, let's just call it. It's not going to work for me because I haven't actually created these. Don't actually do what I'm doing now, or you know, if you want to take notes, you can. And then you might add like another setter, and then you would have to create like a separate onClick method or some kind of logic in the onClick method to determine which activity it is, etc., etc. This is going to make our simple button class explode. So that's the first issue. There's a lot more issues. For example, what happens if we want to create an image button class? Once again, we're basically going to be copying all of this code in here and then pasting it into this other class. And once again, when we have different activities, we're going to have to handle all those different scenarios. So hopefully you can sort of grasp what I'm getting at here. This is not a good way to solve this problem. This solution could be classified as tightly coupled, which means that it's highly dependent. Well, it is dependent, for example, on this main activity class. It's dependent on whatever class is creating the button. And if we have a whole bunch of different activities or a fragment, then that's going to create huge problems and a whole bunch of extra code that we shouldn't have to write. So hopefully I've done a good job of explaining why this is kind of a working solution, but it's a bad solution when our requirements start to change. So let's hop into an example of a way to solve this problem with interfaces. Alright, so just when we thought we were finished our problem of handling click events, our project manager comes by and informs us of some changing requirements. And I want you to really take note of that word because it's a really important concept. So our project manager now explains to us that we need to be able to handle click events for more widgets. You could think image button, edit text, etc. We now need to handle multiple different classes. And this new thing called fragments just came out. And we need to be able to handle click events in fragments as well, the same way that we handle them in activities. So obviously, with our current solution, that's just simply not going to be possible. It is possible, but in the worst way, in which you would have to add so many dependencies to every class, and it would just turn into spaghetti code. It would be like impossible to test, and we just really don't want to do that. But fortunately for our project manager, we don't work at Apple, and we're actually concerned about doing a really great job and writing good code. Okay, I'm totally kidding. Apple has excellent excellent engineers, and according to my research, the actual concept of a Java interface was borrowed from Objective-C's concept of protocols. So totally joking there. Anyways, moving on. So we now have a whole bunch of new requirements that we need to solve. So we're in a bit of a predicament. We have to change our software architecture flat out. It's just not working for us. So fortunately, I don't know what happens next, but maybe a senior Android developer comes over and says, just use a goddamn interface. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to make an interface to solve this problem. So before we do that, there's a little bit of prep we need to do. For starters, I'm going to suggest that you right-click on main activity 1, copy it, paste it into the package. Same package is fine. And then we're going to call this main activity 2. Also do the same thing with the button class. And the reason why I'm having you do this is just for reference later on. Alright, so we've created our copies, main activity 2 and button 2. So what we're going to do next is, for starters, let's just look at our button 2 class. So there's a problem here. We need to remove, well, we can definitely remove that dependency. we need to figure out some way so that our button class doesn't care what activity calls it, or sorry, what activity is interacting with it, what activity is connected and communicating to it. Now, the way that you can solve this problem is through an interface. Now, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time explaining what it is. Let's just jump into a direct example. I'll show you how to build one, and we'll see how it solves the problem. So, what I'm trying to say here is, try and just follow along and don't think about it too much if you get stuck. Head over to the main package, right-click on it, and go to New Class. So we're going to call this new class onWidgetClickListener. Oops. OnWidget. Man, I'm bad at typing. I moved my keyboard around too much. OnWidgetClickListener. And we're not actually going to make a class. We're going to make an interface. Just like that. Now, if you're working in a different IDE, all you need to do is just create a class like normal, and then you can just change the word class to interface, and that should set it up properly for you. So, we've just created an interface. How do they work? Well, let's hop over to main activity for a moment. We've got this method onClick interactivity. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to include this same method in whatever activity or fragment or whatever class needs to use it. So we're going to make some changes. Instead of handling clicks by sort of having a method included within the main activity 2 class, we're just going to get rid of that, and I'm going to move it over to the interface, so to speak. So the way that interfaces work is you can, and I'm only explaining basic functionality. There's other stuff you can do, but we're just working on the basics here. So what you can do is you can include method signatures in the interface. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to type void onClick. I'm going to pass the same parameters as before. So we're going to say int view ID and then a colon. So what we have here is a method signature, specifically this part here. So the way that this works is that any class which says implements interface must include the required methods that are included in the interface. That's kind of hard to explain, so let's just see what it does. I'm going to hop over to main activity 2, and I'm going to type implements onWidgetClickListener. Now, as you can see here, my IDE has lit up like a Christmas tree. So what I'm going to do is it's telling me class main activity 2 must either be declared abstract or implement abstract methods, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to hit Alt-Enter when I'm sort of clicking on the red part. And this is just a shortcut. And then I'm going to hit Implement Methods. And then we're going to implement onClick from the interface. So as you can see here, we once again have almost exactly the same onClick method. The only key difference is that it has this word here, override. And basically what that's telling us is that this method actually comes from an interface. It's not sort of a method from the main activity 2 class. So the important thing to note here is that we've sort of removed a dependency by doing that. Instead of button 2 calling onClick on our main activity class, our main activity 1 class, we're going to set it up so that it's calling the interface method, which is what we'll do next. So, in main activity 2, I'm just going to once again type here, handle event somehow, just for our own notes. And I'm going to talk about one last thing with this interface. Notice that we're not actually typing a method body in here. We're not allowed to say, you know, do stuff here. All of that gets handled in the class which implements the interface. Now, there are sort of like default methods and things where you can actually handle stuff in the interface, but as I say, we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to do basic functionality. Just take note that we're only giving it a method declaration, I believe is what that's called. And then whatever happens gets handled in the activity itself, in the class which implements the interface. So hopefully that's clear. Let's look at how we can set this up in our button2 class. So we're going to do things differently, but in a very subtle way. We're no longer going to have an explicit dependency on this main activity class. We're going to change that to depend on an interface instead. So we're going to say private on widget click listener, whatever, on widget click listener, there. And then we're going to create a setter for that. So I'm going to click, I'll just click down here, hit right click, generate. I always forget that it's Alt insert. And then we're going to create a setter for this new onClick listener variable. And let me just remove that because that's kind of in the way. Alright, so we've got our new method here. I'm actually just going to delete this whole set main activity one thing, and I'm going to delete this as well. We've got examples of how to do that in button 1. So let's just clear that and make our class look a little cleaner. So we've removed the dependency on a specific class. So that's like really the big takeaway with this interface, and we'll see how that helps us later on. Now, instead of saying main activity 1.onClick, we're actually just going to call that on the interface variable instead. So we're going to say on widget click listener dot onClick. This method, of course, exists within our interface. And by extension then, since our activity implements said interface, it includes this onClick method. So all we need to do now is, instead of saying button.setMainActivity1 this, we're going to say button.set button2, sorry, we're going to say button2. I was confusing myself for a second there. Which doesn't have that old method. We're going to say .set on widget click listener, but we're still going to pass this. Now, this is another really key point here, which you need to understand. The reason why we're allowed to say this, and again, this refers to main activity 2, is because it implements the interface. So if I go ahead and just remove that, we're going to get an error here. And it says, button 2 cannot be applied to main activity 2. Hopefully you can see that. I might zoom in the editing. So by including the interface, we're able to pass this. As far as our button 2 is concerned, it doesn't care that we're passing in an activity or a fragment or whatever, as long as whatever activity is calling set on widget click listener implements the interface. And the result of that is that our button 2 only interacts with whatever class it is through the interface. So that's a really, really powerful idea, and that's actually how we solve this issue. So we've now set it up. Let me just double check that everything's proper. Yep. And yep. So we've now set up our classes to communicate via interface instead of concrete class, or sorry, instead of like directly calling methods on specific classes. So let's have a look at how we can, let's say we have to create a test application with a fragment that needs to handle clicks on the buttons, and then we'll also create another widget which uses this interface as well. So let's go ahead and do that now. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a scenario where, hypothetically, we need to add the same functionality to a new kind of widget, which will be an image button, and to a fragment instead of an activity. Now, once again, this is kind of just pseudocode. Don't take it super seriously, but take the lesson that we've basically made it so that our code is loosely coupled. It's not dependent on calling specific, like, concrete class methods. It's dependent upon the interface and making sure that both the button and the activity or fragment or whatever, or the image button, respect and use the interface, and that's how they communicate instead of direct calls. So what we're going to do is head over to this button 2, right-click on it, hit copy, paste it into the package, and we're going to call this image button. And we're going to do the same thing with main activity 2. Except we're going to call it just fragment. Really doesn't matter what it's called. Now, one thing we need to do is, since this is a fragment, we need to make it extend fragment. And I'm also going to change protected to public to respect the fragment. That's all set there. We won't bother with the set content view, doesn't matter. You would need to set that in on create view in a real fragment instance, but we're just going to pretend that we don't have to do that stuff for now. And as you can see here, we've got some code, and we've got our interface, which is handled correctly. So basically what we're going to do now is I want to have a button2 widget. We're going to kind of pretend that this fragment contains a button, and it also contains our image button class. So we're just going to say image button, and we'll make sure we choose the one from our project, which will have our projects package instead of android.widget. We're going to call that image button equals new image button. And on this class, we're going to say image button dot set on widget click listener, and we're going to pass in this again. So notice that once again, we're allowed to pass in our fragment as an interface as far as the image button is concerned. Let's head over to our image button. Just to really hammer this home, once again, our image button or our button2 class or whatever doesn't care what the actual type of the class is that sort of calls this set on widget click listener method. It doesn't care what the actual type is as long as it implements our interface, and it's only going to communicate with this object based on our interface methods, which is of course defined in our interface itself. So as you can see here, we'll just kind of pretend that we don't have to bother implementing this image button differently. Let's just assume that we've already done that. And as you can see here, we have two different kinds of widgets. Doesn't matter what they are, as long as they have this interface, the callback, the click listener. And we've got different types of classes on the other end of the interface. And it doesn't matter what those are. It just matters that they respect the interface or the contract that the interface creates. So hopefully this has given you some food for thought when it comes to interfaces. Basically, the power in them is that we can drastically reduce what's called tight coupling in our code, which is sort of like those direct dependencies. If we go back to button 1, by having this dependency on main activity 1, that is very tight coupling, and while there are scenarios where that's not an issue, in this case we want to be able to use all kinds of different widgets and all kinds of different fragments and activities and all that stuff, and that is a perfect scenario where we want loose coupling. And the last point that I'll end on is that, as you can see, by using an interface, we have sort of proactively handled changing requirements. Our Android team could come out with a new thing similar to a fragment, maybe a compound view class, which needs to handle clicks in the same way. All we would need to do is have that class implement the interface, and then it can now communicate with image buttons, edit texts, buttons, what have you. So hopefully I've done a good job of explaining what interfaces are, how to create them, and how they can help you write better code and solve software architecture problems. If not, let me know in the comment section below. I'm happy to try and give extra explanations, because this stuff isn't super complicated, but it definitely takes a little while to get it down. And I think the best way for you to practice and understand the concept is to just jump into code, use it in an example app that you've created, and see what it can do for you. So without further ado, thank you very much for watching, and let's hop over to the outro.